Hey everybody, it's Michelle Ann Johnson with Speech Queen. All right, here's video number 2. This is Phil, who is the guy, if you watched the last video with Steve Jobs, the guy that Steve Jobs passed to. So we're going to look at Phil's section, a couple of snippets from Phil's section. I think it's just really helpful to compare different speakers, see different qualities, because everybody's going to be different. It's not about having everybody look the same. It's about enhancing and bringing out everybody's individual personalities so that you are the best presenter that you can be. So we're going to look at Phil, and I'm going to share some things that I think Phil is doing really well, and also share some adjustments that I would make if I were working with Phil. Okay, so let's get started.
Thanks, Steve.
Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. I am really excited to be the one to talk to you about iPhone in the enterprise.
Okay, so if you remember the last video I did with Steve Jobs, I talked about, I kind of made a big deal about how emotionally expressive Steve Jobs was, that when he said, I'm excited to be here, that you really saw, he smiled a little bit, and it really came through. So Phil is a different person. He's not as emotionally expressive as Steve Jobs, but I still get that emotion because his voice is expressive. So one thing that I really like about Phil is that he's got a nice voice. He's got, he's not monotone. He uses a nice range of notes, a little bit on the high end, a little bit on the low end. So there's a nice musical quality. And he said, I'm really excited to be the one to talk with you about the enterprise. So he really leaned on that word really to just give it a nice emphasis out of the other words that he was saying. And so that's another way of showing emotion. It doesn't always have to be one way or the other, as long as the emotion is coming through. All right?
From the beginning of launching iPhone, which is not so long ago, we've had some great customers right at the forefront wanting to work with us to adopt the iPhone into their enterprise environments. For example, Genentech. As you know, Genentech is the world's leading biotech company. We have a great relationship with Genentech, their CEO.
So one thing that I'm noticing with Phil is, so in the Steve Jobs video, I talked about how relaxed Steve Jobs was. His arms were down to his sides, he was just very, very loose. One thing I'm noticing with Phil is there's a little bit of tension in his torso. He's holding his arms up kind of high on his body, and they're kind of locked in that one position. And so that just lets me know that there's some tension. And also the thing that it does is it's because he's tense, he's not breathing as deeply as he could be if he were more relaxed. And I can tell because he's breathing almost after every sentence. So he's saying one thing, and then you can almost hear him breathe, as opposed to taking one deep breath and being able to hold his breathing and say a couple of sentences and have that go on and on and on without having to take a breath, because he's taken a nice deeper breath at the very beginning, like I just did. So if I were working with Phil or anybody and I saw that they were locked in one position, I would just ask them to drop their arms to their sides, shake them, loosen up those muscles so that they can really connect to their breath and support as they're speaking. So one thing to look out for, if you find yourself locked in, drop your arms, relax, take a deep breath, and reconnect.
Levinson is a great board member for Apple, so we do a lot of wonderful things together. And right now at Genentech, they have thousands of iPhones deployed across multiple organizations, from sales
he's just breathing.
to R&D. To get a sense for what does the iPhone mean inside Genentech, the quote here from Todd Pierce, VP of Corporate Information Technology: "The iPhone is a watershed event in mobile computing for corporations."
Okay, so one technique that he's using here is he's using recommendations and referrals, to give credibility to the iPhone. So, as I'm sure you guys are doing this, but it's always great to use an example if you're really trying to get a new product or service into market. You want to get those great examples of big customers that you're working with, nice referrals to lend that credibility and legitimacy to whatever you're trying to push out into the market. You know what? I'm going to move a little bit ahead because I want to show you a nice example of using contrast and comparison to show the difference between an old product or service and a new product or service. And Phil does a really good job of this. So I'm just going to move ahead a little bit and let's just jump into it.
Well, to help explain it, I find it useful to understand the old way before we look at the new way. So there is an older way to do things that some have made to work using older generation smartphone devices. If you ever see any of these around, they do get push email and contacts and calendaring.
Okay, so one thing I just would want to take a note of here is, so he made it sounds like he's making a little bit of a, he's throwing some shade on BlackBerry, who was iPhone's biggest competitor at the time, right? So you hear him say this older generation, and then you hear the audience laugh a little bit, right? And so, but he doesn't really respond to the audience's laughter. And so that's not a horrible thing. It's not horrible. But one thing that I would just note is when you're presenting, you want to be alive to what's happening in the room. Okay. So, if the audience laughs or something goes wrong, just go with it because it makes us feel as if you're really present. Because often we can get into our script, we can get into our agenda, and we lose that connection with, just what's happening live in the room. And so, with him, it just makes me question, did he mean to make the joke? I think he did. And if the audience is laughing, you can acknowledge it a little bit. You can give a little bit of a wink. You don't have to make a big meal out of it, but you can just let us know that you're in on the joke, we're in on the joke, and we're sharing in the joke together. Just being alive and present to what's happening.
And you think they come from the servers in the environment, but they don't actually work that way. They first come, for example, to your device from a network operations center that is outside your firewall. It's even outside the country for most people. And that has to get its information from something that's inside your firewall that you have to set up, that's a proprietary messaging server, and that's where it comes from. And of course, that gets its data from your Exchange server. So you actually see that what's been built up is a complex scenario that actually takes some money to support and maintain and build and license. And of course, it adds risk to reliability, as we've seen from time to time. Well, that's the old way.
See, another example. So the audience starts laughing at something that they feel is funny. So again, it's like, did he mean to make that joke? Is he uncomfortable with the fact that the audience is laughing? We don't really know because he's not being transparent about it. So if you mean to make a joke, be transparent about it. If you don't mean to make a joke and the audience starts to laugh, respond to it because they're laughing. So he's just kind of pushing through. Again, it's not horrible. This is just about refining and really fine tuning. Okay. So the other thing, if you notice, he just simplified this process, which I'm sure is very technical for a non-technical person like myself. But he just went, we go from A to B to C to D. Very, very easy. No words on that slide, just all visuals. And it's just a really nice, simple clarification of a really complex process.
Microsoft has really come up with an architecture that's much more advanced and the kind of things enterprises want to build in. They've built in a way with ActiveSync, the ActiveSync protocol, where the iPhone can now work directly with the Exchange server.
Okay, so he's just contrasted. Here's the old way of doing things, A to B to C to D. With the iPhone, you just go from A to D. So just really nice, simplified process. The other thing I want to mention is I notice that he's a lot more engaged, a lot more passionate, a lot more enthusiastic when he starts talking about the technology, which lets me know that this is what he likes to geek out on. There's a reason why he's up there with Steve Jobs, because he's really passionate about technology. So his personality starts to come through a lot more in this section than it did in the beginning of his talk. And so if I were working with somebody like Phil, I would try to get that same emotion and that passion and that enthusiasm that he shows for the technology. I would try to have him bring that in earlier on. When you're talking about stuff that you're not really that passionate about, it's easy to just kind of talk through it. And if you're just talking through it just because you got to get through it, well, the audience feels that. So you've got to find a way to have an emotional connection to whatever it is you're talking about, even if it's quotes, you're reading quotes from Stanford University. You've got to find that emotional connection. Otherwise, the audience won't feel it either. So, couple of things. So, takeaways for this video. I would talk about and really remember Phil's the tension that he had in his body, how it was really blocking him from being relaxed and taking those deep breaths. But one thing that Phil has going for him is he's got a really great voice. And so there's more than one way to show emotion. It doesn't just have to be through your face. It can also be through your voice as well. And also, using comparison and contrast. If you're trying to differentiate the old way from the new way, or the status quo from what you'd like to see, the vision, a really easy way to distinguish between an old paradigm and a new paradigm. And then lastly, try to find a way to have an emotional connection to whatever it is you're talking about. I know it's really hard sometimes when you're talking about things that you're just not as interested in, but trust me, that comes across to the audience, especially if you get to a section where you really are interested. And now we've got the contrast and we can really see that we've been robbed because you're giving it to us in the other section where you really are connected. Find a way to connect all the way through, starting from the very beginning. Okay? Hope this was helpful, guys. I'm looking forward to the next video. Until then, be well.